this morning. As I'm getting set up, maybe I can get you to ask the person next to you, who is the most famous person you've ever been in the presence of? Discuss. All right. Let's bring it back really quickly. Were there any names worth mentioning? I'm curious, actually. Maybe top the person in next to you if you feel that their name, their famous person was worthy. Any famous people worthy of mentioning from anyone? No?
Our friend mate Jay Chow.
Jay Chow. Oh, that rates in this room clearly, Jay Chow. Anyone else? One more? Famous people? No, we're all pretty. Huh? Darryl Braithwaite. It's a blast from the past. Horses, look it up, guys. Horses, Darryl Braithwaite. Great song. Well, the reason I asked you that question is because as a part of the prep for my sermon this morning, I was thinking about the way that people can tend to approach celebrities, right? Some people are totally starstruck, got their phones out, taking selfies. Oh, can I get your autograph, please? Da, 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 da. You've seen them, right? Maybe you've even been them. Then there's the rest of us, and I put myself squarely in this category. Some of you may not know I once shared the same tennis court as Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic, just to name drop a few. Now, before you get too impressed, I was just a line umpire, the guys yelling out, right? I wasn't rallying with them at all, but I was there, close enough to almost touch them, right? And look, I love tennis, but standing there watching arguably, actually not arguably, the three greatest tennis players ever, I remember distinctly thinking, there was a moment I thought, well, like they're just blokes, right? I mean, they're really phenomenally good at hitting a fuzzy yellow ball, but in the end, they're just guys, just like me. And look, maybe that's an Aussie thing. Aussies who by reputation, we're apparently quite the irreverent bunch. We don't do ceremony. We don't stand on formality. We sit in the front seat of the taxi. We skip titles and go straight to first names. Heck, we don't even really do first names at times, right? We shorten them, don't we? Like things like Bazza or Dazza, Wazza, Jono, right? It's not my real name, guys. But the list goes on, yeah? Familiarity over formality every single time. Here's where my brain went to next. Because what if that's not just how we treat celebrities, but how we can tend to treat God as well? A familiarity over formality, which is the total opposite, right, of how Christians used to relate to God, a lot of them, especially during the medieval church history, where God was someone that you just didn't get close to, right? Couldn't get close to, like he's distant, up there, terrifying if you were honest. But somewhere in the last 100 years, we've sort of swung hard the other way, right? To the point where now, for so many, God is more like Father Christmas in the sky. He's soft, tame, an indulgent grandparent who could never really be mad at you because, I mean, look at you. How could he? But here's the question, right? Because is that the one true God as he has revealed himself in the Bible, is that what he is actually like? Right, that's something we're going to be thinking through this morning. But as a starting point, can I just ask you this, to consider this? Because which one are you when it comes to how you relate to God? Are you the starstruck ones, in awe, at a distance, hardly able to look? Or are you the overly familiar ones, right? So casual, so at ease, as maybe you've forgotten who exactly you're standing in front of? Because our passage this morning has something to say to both groups, right? As we dive back into our series on the life of David, and we're up to 2 Samuel, which is a passage that comes off of the back of a whole bunch of activity, a whole bunch of really good activity for God's people, the nation of Israel, as these two things have just happened back in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And feel free to turn there for reference. But firstly, in chapter 5, there's a political win. right at the start of chapter 5, all the tribal leaders of Israel, they come to David and they say, in the past, Saul was king over us, but now we recognize that you, David, are the Lord's anointed, and so we're here to join forces with you. And just like that, the civil war is over. Israel's finally united under the Lord's anointed king. And so that's the first big thing that's happened right before chapter 6. Off of the back of that united front comes all this military success we find. As the newly crowned king of Israel, David, he defeats the Philistines, not just once, but twice, right, with the Lord guiding him the whole way. And so for the people of Israel, at this point, there's a real political stability as well as all this military success. Everything is finally falling into place. All is well. One of the reasons why I think David decides now is the time to do something pretty big. How do we know it's big? Well, as we see him in verse 1, gathering 30,000 men, which at first glance sounds like he's going up or gearing up for another war, right? With his army of men, but then we realize he's just defeated the Philistines, and so it can't be that. And so what's he doing with all these men? Well, this we find. As David decides that now is the time to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, David's capital city. Now for some of you, I'm guessing that the Ark, that's going to ring a bell, right? Because maybe you've read up on the Ark before, or maybe you saw the classic movie Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is something. But going by a lot of your reactions, a lot of, or lack thereof, my guess is that for most of us in this room, I'm just not sure whether the Ark landed for a lot of us. And so given that, let me just take a moment to go through a few things you're going to need to know to get the significance of what's happening here. Because what is the Ark of the Covenant? It was essentially a wooden box covered in gold, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, made back in the days of Moses, built to God's own instructions. You can read all about it in your own time in Exodus chapter 25, when it was first designed, how back there it said on top of the box there's this lid called the mercy seat, made of pure gold, the place where once a year, on the Day of Atonement, blood was sprinkled there to cover the sin of the people, right? Literally the mercy seat, the place where God's mercy met Israel's sin. And then on either end of it, there were 2 cherubim mentioned here in verse 2, also gold, facing each other with their wings stretched out over the top. These cherubim, who, contrary to popular opinion, they're not chubby little angels. No. In the Bible, they're guardians, right? The same guardians who were stationed at the gate of Eden, remember, with a flaming sword, to keep sinful humanity out of God's presence. So there are 2 of those facing each other, guarding this seat, which is all very lovely, but here's a significant part. God said to Moses in Exodus 25, "There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, I will speak with you." And so this box, it's not just a fancy piece of furniture, it's a meeting point, right? The place where the holy God of Israel came down and spoke with his people. Which brings us to what was inside the box, right? 3 things. First, there were the 2 stone tablets, the 10 Commandments, the ones that Moses carried down the mountain after speaking with God face to face. Second, the staff of Aaron, Moses' brother, the first priest of Israel. And third, a jar of manna, which is a reminder of how God fed his people day after day in the wilderness. But these 3 objects, they're all pointing to the same thing, right? The ark was a symbol of God's presence. Here's how it's described in verse 2. The ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. So the box was, in essence, God's throne on earth. Right there between the 2 cherubim was where his name, God himself, would dwell. The place he'd draw near, the place that you just didn't wander into carelessly, which matters for what happens next. But that's the ark, right? That's what David's about to go and get. Get from where, you might ask? Well, the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, we're told. And how did it end up there? Well, for the answer to that question, we've got to go back to 1 Samuel 4. There's a lot of cross-referencing this morning, but 1 Samuel 4, back when Israel first took the ark out into the battlefield against the Philistines, like a lucky charm. But it didn't work. Israel got routed, the ark was captured, but it turned out to be a bad move for the Philistines though, right? Wherever they put it, their idol fell on its face. Wherever they put it, a plague broke out. And so after 7 months, they sent it back. It ended up in the house of Abinadab on a hill in Kiriath Jearim, we're told. And there it stayed, right? Not for months, but not a couple of years, but at least 20, we're told. You then add in Saul's 40-year reign and David's rise on top of that, and you're looking at an entire generation growing up without the ark anywhere near the center of Israel's life. And so, given context, you can imagine, right, this is a red letter day, a huge day, the day that David and his men go up to bring the ark back into the very heart of their lives. It's a big day that deserves a big procession, a massive party, because look, the ark, it's coming home. And so they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new ark with the ark of God, new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. When I first read that, I was like, man, we need castanets and harps and whatever a sistrum is, right? Playing while we sing. Why don't we, Ben? No. But that's a sentiment, right? That's what people are feeling. A sentiment that was about to be very, very short-lived. Because what happens next is, I'm not sure you felt it in the reading. What happens next is as shocking as it is surprising, right? Something that basically turned this party into a funeral quick smart. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of this irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Now, before we get to the part of this story we don't really understand, let's start with the part that I think most of us do. As they're rolling the ark of the covenant back to Jerusalem, there's a moment when the oxen stumble, the cart jolts, the ark shifts. Uzzah's natural reaction is to put his hand out to steady it. It's okay, everyone, I've got this. And almost instantly, the music stops because Uzzah is lying there next to the ark in a heap, not moving because he's dead. What? How? And why? Sure you're asking. This totally jarring moment that even John Calvin, one of the great reformers of the Protestant Reformation, said this. I mean, here is a man attempting to honor God, burning with a good and holy devotion, punished almost like a criminal. That's what it seems, right? At first glance. Unfair. I mean, this guy was just trying to help. I mean, what was he supposed to do? Let the ark fall? I mean, how could God possibly punish someone that severely for a knee-jerk reaction? Like, what would you say if someone asked you that? Where would you go looking for an answer to that question? Well, I guess you'd start right at the start, yeah? Because even as they're loading the ark onto the cart, back in verse 3, that should have already been a red flag to David, the one in charge. Because the ark came with clear instructions from God on how to move it. Numbers chapter 4. Israelites were told it had to be covered with several layers. It also says there how the Kohathites, the family responsible for the holy things, they were told explicitly not to touch it nor look at it lest they die. And it was never ever to go on a cart like it did here. No, it was supposed to go or to be carried on shoulders using poles built into the ark for that exact purpose. None of which happened here. One of the reasons I think the text calls what Uzzah did an irreverent act or an error. Not just because the instructions weren't followed, though they weren't, but because it seems that nobody had fully grasped just how serious it is for sinful humanity to come into contact with what is holy, pure, set apart, God himself. And that's why he died that day. Now, I know that explanation is not going to satisfy everyone in this room. I know that for a fact. But here's what struck me as I'm reading this story over and over again, trying to make sense of it for myself. The text doesn't try to justify God's actions. Right? I mean, we're given one small reason why and nothing more. Right? No, there's no fuller explanation, which is, I think, for me anyway, it's hard to swallow, yeah? Coming to grips with the fact that when it comes down to it, God doesn't owe us an explanation. He doesn't owe us anything. Right? Like he doesn't have to explain himself to us. And look, even if he did, what did the prophet Isaiah say in chapter 40 of Isaiah? Who has understood the mind of the Lord? Who has instructed him or been his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? Implication, no one. No one at all. Because the purposes of God, the wisdom of God, when it comes to they're ultimately incomprehensible to us. Which is why when we look at his judgments, often, it's like looking down a hole so deep we just can't see the bottom. As you're processing that, there's a lot to process here in this first point. Here's something else worth sitting with. A point that was made by a commentator. I was reading it, sort of stuck with me. He was saying that how passages like this one are actually evidence for the Bible's trustworthiness, its supernatural origin even. Because here's the thing. If you were inventing a God for people to worship, would you write a story like this one into your holy book? Or a story that is eerily similar to this one in the book of Acts, where a silly couple sell a piece of property, they keep back some of the proceeds, pretend they're giving it to the apostles, all of it, but then Peter exposes the lie, and God strikes them both dead right there on the spot. Nobody in their right mind, I think, would invent a God like that, which is exactly why you should trust that this really happened. As you're thinking about this, those two stories, one in the Old Testament, other in the New, Ananias and Sapphira, that helps us in another way too, I realized. Because how often do you hear people say, well, I believe in the God of the New Testament, not the Old. Because that God is kind and loving, but this God, Old Testament God, he's harsh, right? But the answer is no. It's the same God, isn't it? You read your Bible closely and you'll see it, the same God, holy and just and righteous the whole way through, unable to sweep sin under the carpet, out of sight, out of mind. Now, I said, what to process. I'm not sure how you're feeling about all of that. Maybe you're struggling with it, wrestling with how this can be internally, refusing to even believe it's real or true. Or maybe you're angry at God, like David was angry, we find. Not so much at God, I think, but more at what he'd done as the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah. Ironically, you turn back and David had been thrilled when that same terrifying power burned against the Philistines in his favor. But when it burned against one of his own, deserved or not, that was something else entirely, hey. Now, we're going to keep moving, but as we keep reading, we find there's a moment in the story when David's mood starts to shift from anger to fear. As he starts to understand not so much why this happened, but more so who it was that did this. It says in verse 9. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? Which is the exact same response the men of Beth Shemesh had back when the ark first returned from Philistine territory, 1 Samuel chapter 6, when back then 70 of them were struck down for simply looking at the ark. Right? Again, God had warned his people that would happen. And so the people who survived back then say in response back then, if that's the case, well, who then is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? Like, if God is this serious, how in the world can you approach him? Which is basically David's question, right? As he's realized the God who is holy is the God who is dangerous. He's dangerous to his enemies. He's dangerous to his own people. And that's why David struggles to answer the question, how can God ever come to us? How can God ever live with us? Because, God, he is so holy that sin is just burned up in his presence. And the problem is we're soaked in sin. Some of us in here, we feel that more than others, but you know it's true, right? There's a commentator, Tim Chester, has this great illustration. It's like we're a rag doll soaked in the flammable liquid of our sin, and God's a raging fire. If God comes anywhere near us, or if we go anywhere near God on our own, we'll be consumed by the holy fire of his presence. The very thing that Uzzah found out the hard way when he reached out and God struck him down. Holy, dangerous, not safe. Which that last phrase that I've used in the title reminded me of a scene from well-known movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where there's a moment the children hear the name Aslan, this massive, wise, powerful talking lion for the first time. Something stirs in them. They don't know why, and so Susan, one of the kids, asks the obvious question, is Aslan safe? Mr. Beaver, another character, he answers her, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Not safe, but good. Which is important to remember, these two things. Because if we just stop there, right here, at this point, and this is another reason why it's important to read the Bible in its full and proper context, right? Instead of just cherry-picking the verses we like and discarding the ones we don't. If we just stop there, we'd walk away thinking God is just terrifying. Someone to avoid, someone to keep at arm's length, but that's only half the picture. I mean, sure, God isn't safe, especially when his holiness isn't recognized or his commands not followed. I mean, Uzzah found that out. But if you keep on reading, here's what we find. And let me just put a quote up there to get us thinking about what's coming up next. The fact that we can't live with God because he's dangerous to sinners, but we can't live without him either, for God is the source of all good things. Because here's what happens next in the story. Because of David's question, how can this ark ever come to me? And because he can't find a good answer to that question, he makes the decision. We're not taking this ark into Jerusalem, right? Not into my city, because he's afraid of it. Why he ends up parking it in somebody else's house. A guy named Obed-Edom, the Gittite, from the Philistine city of Gath. And so he's not one of God's people, he's a Philistine, right, the enemy. Which actually makes some sense why David would want to put the ark, this dangerous ark, there, right? Because this is a bit too scary for me, guys. How about you, Obed, look after it for a while? So that's what happens. The ark stays at Obed's house, stays there for 3 months. Which, I mean, I can just imagine his friends are coming over and what they think. Like, hey, Obed, what's that big golden box you've got there? And he's like, well, honestly, I don't really know, guys. But here's what I do know. Ever since it showed up, things have been going great. The family's getting along. The crops are thriving. Fruit's never been riper. It's like the blessing of God just landed on us out of nowhere. I can't explain it. Because that's essentially what happened, right? The text says, the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. I mean, God blessed him so much that word eventually got back to David. Something completely the opposite to what happened to Uzzah has now happened to this Gentile, this non-Jew. Which I think there's something remarkable in that, isn't there, right? That the same God who burned with anger against Uzzah for his own good reasons turns around and blesses this foreigner, someone with no claim on him whatsoever. The first thing that tells me that God is good as he blesses someone just totally undeserving, someone outside of his covenant people altogether, an act that's enough to make David think, well, maybe let's have another crack at bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. Which sets up the second way that we can know that God is good from this passage. Let me set it up like this. By pointing you, and a lot of homework, guys, for cross-reading. 1 Chronicles 16. See, a different version or account of this exact event. 1 Chronicles 16. Because in that account, we're told there that this time David tries to bring the ark back. The people carrying the ark were the actual people who should have been carrying it the whole time, like the Levites. Like David's learned his lesson, it seems. There's an improper way to do this and a proper way to do this. And the proper way included the Levites, as well as no more carts, as it says there, when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord this time. Because this time we're going to do this the way God said we should. But that's not what I wanted to camp on, this last little bit. Because here's what I wanted you to see. It says there, when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he, David, sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. So they barely started the journey when David stops everything, right? Let's stop here, guys. Let's pause. Let's acknowledge the goodness of God and sacrifice to him. Which is something that he'd do again as they got to Jerusalem, verses 17 to 18. Now, if you're not familiar with sacrifices back then, again, more reading, sorry guys. Leviticus, chapters 1, 3, 7, 16, 17. Good starting point for sacrifices, right? To understand what David's doing here, the significance of it as he's sacrificing to God with bulls and fattened calves, these burnt offerings, these peace offerings. Just what they represented to the people, right? Things like atonement for sin, right? Dealing with God's wrath, thanksgiving. Again, I think this is David putting the pieces together, right? As he's like, oh, I never asked God how to do this the first time around, as he didn't carry the ark the way it was supposed to be carried, and people died because of it. And so these sacrifices were offered, in a sense, I think, to atone for his or their sin, to ask for the forgiveness of sin. This, the second way I think we see God's goodness, the fact that even after his people's failure, like he's already made a way for them to be with him again. Not by pretending Uzzah didn't happen, not by lowering the bar on his holiness, but through sacrifice. The way God's wrath is satisfied. The way God's people can be reconciled to him. The way joyful fellowship gets restored through sacrifice, which is also basically the answer to David's question, right? How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? Well, through sacrifice offered by him on the people's behalf. Now, if you're switched on, you'll get the sense that this is where this story stops becoming, or it stops being just David's story and starts becoming ours. Because these sacrifices offered by David, they're ultimately meant to point us forward to the better sacrifice, right? The perfect sacrifice offered by Jesus on our behalf. Jesus, the perfect Lamb of God. So if you think about this story, in this story there were 2 significant deaths, right? Uzzah's death and the death of the animals David sacrifices. Uzzah was struck down for his irreverence. These animals were struck down in Israel's place so Israel wouldn't be. And that substitution is exactly what Jesus came to fulfill once and for all. Not by dying Uzzah's death, a death for his own sin, because he had none, but by dying the animal's death, right? He became the sacrifice, struck down not for his own irreverence, but for ours. As he went to the cross in our place. The cross where all the wrath of God against our sin, all of it was fully absorbed in him. That's the gospel, isn't it? The good news of Jesus that we all hold on to. That God's wrath against sinners is fully and finally satisfied. That's how we, as God's people, are reconciled to him after our missteps, our sin. That's how joyful fellowship with God is restored, not just for a moment, but once and for all, forever. And that is exactly where real joy comes from. Not just relief that the danger's past, but genuine delight. The sort of joy that boils over when you really know that you have been forgiven, which is what we see in the rest of this morning's text. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. It's a very famous passage, this. This passage that basically David dancing before the Lord with everything he's got. Not a performance, not a pre-planned, rehearsed thing for people. No, this is a genuine response from the heart, something that David just couldn't not do in light of who God is. He's holy and yet he's good. And also in light of what God has done, blessed Obed-Edom and made a way for his people to be in his presence in spite of their sin. How could he not dance before God? Which is an important phrase, right? Before the Lord. Because he's not done this before the people, for people. He's done this before the Lord, for God. This is the joy of the Lord. Here's the thing about a joy like that. A joy that's later described as someone cavorting half naked in a public worship ceremony. A joy this unguarded, this undignified, this all in, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. And it wasn't. One person in particular really didn't like it. A woman who at one point was about as close to David as anyone, right? His wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, is what it says. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Strong words, eh? Why? Well, I'm guessing that maybe she was embarrassed by him, embarrassed for him, which, look, honestly, I get as someone who has been known to just sit at the table at wedding receptions while my wife, Leanne, who's next door, goes just absolutely cocoa bananas on the dance floor to the greatest hits of yesteryear. She loves it. I can't stand it. And so I sort of get where my dancing, that came off really weird. But I sort of get where Michal was coming from, right? And Michal eventually gets to the point where she's got to say something. And so she confronts him on this. Listen to how David responds. It was before the Lord who chose me, rather than your father or anyone from the house, his house, when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. He doesn't apologize, does he? He sort of doubles down before the Lord. The exact phrase from the few verses earlier. Because he knew this was never about Michal, never about how it looked. And if giving himself fully to God in worship means looking foolish, undignified, humiliated in front of everyone else who's watching, David's fine with that. More than fine. Because here's the remarkable thing. You get to say, he just doesn't care. And look, it's not because he's careless about his wife or indifferent, what people think in general, but because in this moment, there's just one set of eyes he's dancing for. Not Michal's, not even Israel's, but God's. And nothing anyone watching thinks is going to shrink that joy down to something more respectable. Here's a question that came to mind as I was sitting there processing David's response to who God was and what he had done in his life. Is this kind of joy, the joy of the Lord, evident in my life? Not just in what I say I believe, but in how I actually live. Because here's a temptation for us when it comes to this particular part of the passage, is to just make it about Sunday morning. To make it just about how we look when we sing to God, hands up or hands down, how we look, how we sound in here during service. And look, that's not nothing. I want to downplay that, because, and let me say this, and please take it the way that hopefully it comes across. If we come in here singing about him, but you come in late, and then you come in with a bored look on your face, coffee cup in your hands, mumbling through the words, and checking your phone every few seconds, what does that say to others about the worthiness of God to you? Because that's what worship is, right? The worthiness of God on display. And so what does your worship here in song in particular say to those around you? Because that's a part of it. Like singing matters. How we posture ourselves toward God when we gather matters. But it's not the whole of it. Right? Worship isn't just singing or dancing. It's the whole of life. Right? Every single part of it. Like it says in Romans chapter 12, classic, famous verse. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform you to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so the question, I think, is it's not so much is it obvious from your singing that you get this, but is it obvious from your life that you get this? Right? The fact that a holy, genuinely dangerous God has made a way through Jesus for you to be forgiven and brought near. Or has that good news become so familiar that it stopped producing anything in you that looks like David in that street, unguarded, undignified, all in? Because look, if we've really understood what David understood, the weight of God's holiness and the depth of his mercy, the natural response isn't, a caution. No, it's not keeping our worship tidy and respectable and safe for other people to watch. No, it's a joy that doesn't really care who's looking except one. You know, as I look back at my own life, like I realize I care a lot about what people think. Too much, if I'm honest. Early in ministry, that hamstrung me a lot more than I'd like to admit. Now, look, again, don't get me wrong. It's okay to care what people think, because we care. I care about you. But I've had to learn to be the pastor, friend, husband, father I need to be. I need to care more about what God says or thinks of me in his word than what you think of me. And look, again, hear me. I'm not asking you to put on a show, some crazy dancing. I mean, if you want to, by all means. But right, I don't want you to look like the person next to you who looks like he's all in or she's all in. Like, that'd be no different to David caring what Michal thought, wanting him to be more dignified, more kingly, instead of dancing freely in the streets. Right? But here's a pattern I see all throughout the Bible. When someone truly grasps how loved they are, how forgiven they are, how undeserved God's goodness toward them is, there's always an outpouring. Whether it's Zacchaeus, giving away half his wealth on the spot, or the woman who washed Jesus' feet with that insanely expensive flask of perfume. Because as Jesus said, those who are forgiven much, love much. And as we were preparing the youth to serve this morning, we ran a bit of a session on Thursday night on good and bad reasons to serve. Bad reasons, things like showing off our skills or needing to prove that I'm a real Christian by serving. Well, good reasons, things like imitating Jesus, doing what we were made to do, playing our part in the church family. But then I told them, those good reasons, good as they may be, they're actually not enough on their own. One, because we're naturally selfish, insecure, and people are really hard to love, all of us. So I told them, what then makes serving or singing or dancing or anything else that we do sustainable? Only one thing, I think, and that is the grace of God. We don't do any of this. I don't preach, I don't serve you to earn something from God or to prove something to God or to you. We do it because we've already been given everything. Right? The reason why we do anything as Christians is this: we are responding to his grace. We love and we serve and we obey and we trust because he first loved us. And so is it evident, guys, again, is there a David in the street kind of a joy in your life? If not, I'll tell you, the answer isn't to try harder to look like it. The answer is going back to the cross, letting it sink in all over again, just how much you have been forgiven, just how much this God who isn't safe and yet so good loves you in spite of you because of Jesus. Because when that really lands, you won't be able to help yourself either. And that's exactly what we're about to do. And not try harder, not clean ourselves up first, but come back to the cross, this time with bread and cup in our hands. We're about to participate in the communion meal together to end. Because when I think about it, Jesus is the reason why, and just give me a second, guys, before you unpack, just to stay in this moment. Jesus is the reason we're told in the Bible why we don't do sacrifices anymore. Not because we don't sin anymore, but because the final perfect sacrifice has already come, Jesus. And so instead of sacrificing again and again and again, we do something different. We eat as we celebrate and remember the one who died once to deal with our sin once and for all. And so this morning, if you've trusted in that message, in the good news of Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins, can I encourage you to draw near to this most holy, and yet he's such a good God to us with a full assurance, with grateful hearts, because of what he, our good God, a holy God, has done for us, a bunch of sinners.